Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. In Hebrew, our name is Habitchonistim. IDSF is a leading Israeli organization advocating for strong national security for the State of Israel. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is an expert on all things related to the Israel-US relationship. Yoram, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
If we could start by just sharing with our viewers an update on what is the current U.S. position on this war in Gaza and the level of pressure that the U.S. is putting on Israel, and then we'll discuss how Israel should or can respond to all of that.
Well, the pressure has been systematic from day one, attempting to switch Israel from the military option against Hamas and Hezbollah to the negotiation or diplomatic option, and at the same time, pressure on Israel to facilitate the establishment of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. This has been the State Department worldview from day one, going back, in fact, to 1948, when it opposed the establishment of Israel. And since then, the State Department cosmopolitan, UN-leaning worldview has been very, very critical of Israel, as we see it at this time, and harnessing the issue of military supplies and munition supplies as a means to intensify pressure on Israel.
In your best estimate, why is the U.S. not acting like a stronger ally? What is the nature of this pressure?
Well, it's not the U.S., it's the State Department, which happens at this stage to play the central role in shaping, navigating, designing U.S. foreign policy and national security policy. And therefore, it exerts pressure on Israel. There is, however, or there are other elements which impacts U.S. policy in general and U.S. policy towards Israel in particular, and that's primarily the legislature, which has a co-equal stature in as far as shaping domestic and foreign policy. And unlike the State Department, which has been systematically critical of Israel, both chambers of Congress have been systematically pro-Israel. And then in addition to those two branches of the government, you have the national security establishment, which includes the armed forces, the intelligence establishment, as well as the defense industry. And those elements have been very, very appreciative of the contribution derived by their association with Israel. And they certainly do not identify with the State Department worldview. However, at this stage, the White House allows the State Department to take the center stage as far as shaping U.S. policy. And as long as the State Department is at the center stage, one has to expect intensifying pressure on Israel. And just one more comment. The State Department has been very, very busy producing ideas, formula to bring about Arab-Israeli peace. Every single proposal, every single one failed. And the reason those proposals failed is because they focused on the Palestinian issue. Israel right now has 6 peace accords. And the reason we achieved those peace accords, because each one of them did not focus on the Palestinian issue, and none of them was initiated by the State Department. Likewise, with Saudi-Israel relations, which without peace treaty are still very, very positive relations, both defense-wise as well as commercially. And that progress has not been made by the State Department, but once again, in defiance of the State Department.
Let me ask you a question. I can see from all of the pictures on your wall that you have a lot of experience, a lot of history in diplomacy representing Israel, plus the little Texas hat I see in the corner. Maybe you'll explain that to us. How would you assess the view of the State Department in 2024 versus 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Is there a development in the thinking of the State Department? Has Israel diplomacy been able to shift any positions at all?
I'm not aware that the State Department has changed its worldview going back to 1948. And certainly the current State Department, headed by Secretary Tony Blinken, has demonstrated the classic state of mind of the State Department by displaying cosmopolitan or multilateral worldview, preferring to work with the UN and with international organizations, with the Europeans, rather than an independent America national security policy. I'm not aware that any Israeli administration is able to change the state of mind of the State Department. The only time that I'm aware of where the State Department did not play a central role in shaping foreign policy were the 4 years of the Trump administration, where President Trump literally expelled the State Department from the platform of formulating foreign policy. And again, that's the time when 4 more peace accords were concluded between Israel and Arab countries.
And if we could just bring a little bit of clarity, because some people are writing in the chat, that when we talk about U.S. support for Israel, obviously there's the population of the U.S., there's the House of the Senate, there's the White House, and there's the State Department. So just to clarify, you're talking about the State Department. You're not saying the House and the Senate. You're not even saying the administration, the White House over the past 75 years. You're specifically saying it's a State Department issue.
Well, certainly, because State Department has a role of shaping America's foreign policy. The question is, does an American president consider the State Department a reliable guide in formulating foreign policy, or the president dismisses the worldview of the State Department? The fact has been historically that the American people do not consider the State Department to reflect their own point of view. The State Department is largely universalist, multilateralist, cosmopolitan, and most Americans have very deep appreciation of American first, of American exceptionalism. And since the House especially, but also Senate, reflect the worldview of their constituents in the districts or in the states, therefore, just like most constituents, so have most legislators been at odds with the State Department. And we have seen it in series of recent votes on Capitol Hill, where in spite of the certain erosion in support of Israel, still there is overwhelming support of Israel. And in fact, the special package of foreign aid to Israel, $14.5 billion, was held hostage by the State Department in order to facilitate the approval of the special foreign aid package to Ukraine. It was only when supporters of Israel realized that the State Department, the president, are not willing to release the Israel package that they finally agreed, in spite of their reservations, to approve also the special package to Ukraine. Namely, it was Israel which facilitated the foreign aid package to Ukraine, and the State Department utilized that by holding the package to Israel hostage until the legislature released or approved also the package to Ukraine.
And in your estimation, is the current pressure on Israel from the US only emanating from the State Department, or also from the administration, from Jake Sullivan, from other people outside of the State Department?
Well, currently, or since January 2021, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has been the chief designer, the chief navigator of the US foreign and national security policy. He basically is the one who determines President Biden's foreign and national security policy, and therefore he is the one who made sure that Jake Sullivan would be the national security advisor. Jake Sullivan was working for some time under Tony Blinken during the Obama-Biden administration. It was Tony Blinken who was responsible for the appointment of Jake Sullivan to the role of national security advisors and series of others senior positions in the State Department, and especially on the National Security Council staff. It is Secretary of State who calls the shots, and even the Secretary of Defense does not stray away from that. Few days ago, after speaking with the Israeli Defense Minister, it was the Secretary of Defense who highlighted the importance of Israel switching from the military option to the diplomatic option. You could expect it maybe from the Secretary of State, but to hear Secretary of Defense preferring diplomatic option over military option obviously made it very clear that it is Secretary Blinken who calls the shots, even when it comes to the Pentagon.
Wow. Okay, so now let's look at the Israel side. Can Israel afford to defy this US pressure? What are your thoughts?
Well, the real question is, can Israel afford not to defy State Department's pressure on Israel? And this is in view of the track record of the State Department. State Department has been wrong and wronger and wrongest on a litany of Middle East issues which are independent of Israel. State Department led the march against the Shah of Iran, promoting the rise to power of Ayatollah Khomeini under the delusion that the regime of the Ayatollahs would be very convenient for the US and would be preoccupied with domestic Iranian affair, not with regional and global terrorism. It was the State Department that courted Saddam Hussein until literally the day of the invasion. It was the State Department which led the way. And by the way, at that time, Tony Blinken played a key role in 2011 when the State Department engineered a US-led NATO military offensive against Gaddafi, and that transformed Libya into a chaotic state. Gaddafi was fighting Islamic terrorism, and the downfall of Gaddafi, the lynching of Gaddafi by Islamic terrorism, by the way, complement of the US-led military offensive, transformed Libya into a major platform of anti-American, anti-Western Islamic terrorism, a platform of series of civil wars which erupted in 2011 and still raging throughout Libya. And when it comes to Israel, we have had a systematic State Department pressure on Israel to negotiate with Hamas ever since 2007. And we had few eruptions of war between Israel and Hamas. Each round was over through negotiation, which was facilitated by State Department pressure, and sadly, the support to such pressure by Israeli clones of the State Department, both in the Israeli military establishment and Israeli foreign policy establishment. And we know now that those number of negotiation cycles, which were heralded by the State Department as a major achievement, those were the rounds which bolstered the Hamas capabilities, transformed Gaza into a state of terrorism, the most fortified terrorist state anywhere in the world. It wouldn't happen if Israel would have defied from day one the State Department pressure to negotiate with Hamas. How can anyone assume that something constructive can be achieved by negotiating with an entity which follows a vision, which mandates the elimination, the destruction of the Jewish state? You don't negotiate with such an entity, you devastate such an entity. Similar thing with Hezbollah. Negotiation with Hezbollah has been promoted by the State Department and again facilitated by State Department clones within Israel. And this at the time, by the way, at the time when Hezbollah collaborates with every single drug cartel in Mexico and throughout Latin America in an attempt to flood America with deadly drugs, fentanyl and other such deadly drugs. This is at the time, right now, State Department is pressuring Israel to negotiate another agreement with Hezbollah, while as we speak, Hezbollah trains the Mexican drug cartels in the execution of car bombs, suicide bombers, and improvised explosive devices on America's own soil. Only a few days ago, the FBI director alerted the US that Iranian-supported terrorists, most prominently Hezbollah, is already active on the soil of the US, and this is the entity that the State Department is trying to force us to negotiate with them. But you can go back even to 2006. It was the State Department at that time, headed by Condoleezza Rice, which pressured Israel to allow Hamas to partake in the Palestinian election in Gaza and Judea and Samaria. And that bolstered Hamas' position, basically catapulted Hamas to the leadership of Palestinians in Gaza and the most favorable image among Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. And that all led to October 7. And certainly we can talk about the US pressure on Israel to evacuate its positions from Israel, the Israeli military flight, not evacuation, but flight from Lebanon in 2000, which led to the Second Intifada, which at that time was an unprecedented wave of terrorism. By the way, similar to the US evacuation of flight from Afghanistan, which clobbered devastatingly US posture deterrence throughout the Middle East and providing a major tailwind to the Ayatollahs, to the Muslim Brotherhood, to ISIS, to every single enemy and rival of the US. And obviously, when it comes to State Department pressure on Israel, can Israel afford to comply with that pressure, we can go back to 1981. What would happen to American interest and to Israeli interest if Israel would have gone along with American pressure in 81 to refrain from bombing the Iraqi nuclear reactor? It was that defiance which spared the US 10 years later a potential nuclear confrontation or nuclear war with Iraq. It was that destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor which spared the life of the pro-American Arab regimes in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Oman, and possibly also in Egypt and Jordan. And certainly, what would happen if Israel would have gone along with American pressure to refrain from preemption in 1967? That preemption devastated the Egyptian military, which was on its way to topple every single pro-American Arab oil-producing regime. And it was that Israeli preemption in defiance of the State Department which saved the day for the US economically and national security and denied the Soviet bloc a major bonanza. And one could also ask a question: what would happen if Israel would not have caved in to American pressure to refrain from preemption in 1973? If Israel would have preempted in 1973, it would have spared Israel a major catastrophe, the Yom Kippur War. Sadly, we did comply with US pressure. And the bottom line, I believe, is that whenever it comes to State Department pressure, Israel should be very careful to avoid compliance with that pressure. By definition, the US needs to pressure Israel when the US wants Israel to act against its own assessment of Israel's national security. And Israel's call for national security is definitely more realistic than the state of mind of the State Department. And therefore, in my mind, Israel generally cannot afford to comply with American pressure. It does produce short-term diplomatic and inconvenience. But as the past 76 years replete with Israeli defiance of American pressure prove, that yes, there is a short-term, immediate diplomatic price to be paid, friction, maybe no invitation to come and visit the White House, but in the long run, Israeli defiance of America's pressure has bolstered the American respect for Israel's posture of deterrence, and long-term strategic respect is much more important than short-term diplomatic inconvenience.
Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, this is a lot of food for thought. Thank you for sharing all of this. We're just about out of time, but one very important question as we wrap up. For all of our viewers and supporters in Texas, you have to explain the hat to us.
Well, I did my undergraduate in Texas. I served as Israel's Consul General based in Texas. I have many friends. I have relatives in Texas, and I've learned to respect the Texas state of mind, which is the state of mind of the Lone Star State, while we here in Israel are the people of the Lone Star of David. And the two Lone Stars, that of Texas and that of the Star of David, are Lone Stars because we are facing challenges. And to be faced with challenges in a constructive way produces many opportunities, which Texas has proven as far as its role technologically, industrially, economically within the US, and so has Israel in this environment surrounding us, the Middle East, which is replete replete with military challenges, environmental challenges, climatic challenges, without which we wouldn't have excelled in developing groundbreaking high-tech application, both militarily as well as commercially.
Yoram, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.